Good evening, friends of God, whoever you are and wherever you are on life's journey, ministry's journey. We welcome you to this space. The Ministers Council Live, MC Live, is a monthly gathering opportunity for equipping and sharing among colleagues, where we hope that you feel a sense of connection with other siblings in the various trenches and seasons of ministry. It's a product of a space of the American Baptist Churches USA Ministers Council, and we're glad to invite ecumenical colleagues along the way as sessions indicate that. We're glad to be in fellowship tonight, in fact. So whether you are with us live or among those who are catching the recording, know that we care about you, we're praying for you, and we're here to support your journey in ministry, in centeredness, collegiality, and competence. I'm Reverend Jackie Belisle from Chicago, and honored to greet you tonight on behalf of our national leadership team in our time of greetings and announcements later in the hour. You'll hear more from them, perhaps. I serve as the coordinator of membership and chapter development, and am often in the orbit of this monthly session. Tonight, I want to welcome our colleague, Brian Allain, for his first time with us in conversation, although he and I, over recent weeks, have been hatching up other potential ideas. You know his name through the book, How to Heal Our Divides, no doubt, and the focus of much of our hour this evening together. But I want to just in a moment put his bio in the chat box, and in the meantime say that one of the things that I've been so blessed in learning about Brian as we've had a couple opportunities to fellowship is this intersection of creativity, writing, business, justice, healing, and intriguing collaborations for the kingdom of God. And so tonight we will welcome him to take the baton in a moment. Brian leads a project called Find Your Next Calling, as well as How to Heal Our Divides. Previously, he founded Writing for Your Life, a resource center and conferences for spiritual writers. Publishers in Color, a conference series intended to increase the number of books published by spiritual writers of color. And Compassionate Christianity, a resource center for progressive Christians. Writing for Your Life and Compassionate Christianity are now owned by others as he continues to spin off and release in order to create space for moving on to the next thing. I'm going to let Brian say more about his journey, and including how he came to the interesting project that is before us, and which many of us have a hunger for going deeper in during the course of this year. Brian?
Well, Jackie, thanks so much for having me here, this evening. It's such a pleasure and a thrill, honestly. And, I so greatly appreciate the support that your organization's given to How to Heal Our Divides and, our efforts there. To kind of give you just some background on myself and kind of how we got to where we are today. I spent most of my life doing completely different things. I've got a master's degree in electrical engineering and an MBA. I worked at Bell Laboratories many years ago, led a number of different new businesses, either within big companies or in startup companies, but all within the kind of high tech realm. And several years ago, one of my classmates from business school had asked me to come work with him and help him run a couple of small companies that he owned. And after I was there for a couple of years, he came into my office and said, I've got a project I'd like you to work on. It's for my father-in-law, Frederick Buechner. And at that point in time, I had no idea who Frederick Buechner was. But as soon as I heard about him, I started reading all of his books and was just literally blown away by their insight, their quality, and their depth. And so for those of you not familiar with Mr. Buechner, he published over 40 books, in his lifetime. One was nominated for the Pulitzer Prize. One was nominated for the National Book Award. He has a dozen or so honorary degrees from all these prestigious places, but he had never done any marketing or self-promotion. And so as a result, had no online presence whatsoever. So in December 2012, we launched his first website and social media, and we launched a seminary partnership program where we donated copies of his books to seminaries and sponsored an annual student award for excellence in writing, all these kinds of things to basically introduce him to a new generation of readers. And even though he wasn't writing anymore, we introduced 3 new books. 2 of them were published by Zondervan, kind of hoping to reach, a more evangelical crowd that probably was not in his wheelhouse in his earlier days. And then we self-published a book called Buechner 101 together with Anne Lamott. She was a big Buechner fan, and she said, I need something to give people to tell them to go read this guy that they've never heard of. So, we put together Buechner 101, and she wrote the introduction, and we brought in contributions from Barbara Brown Taylor and Brian McLaren and Thomas Long, and then a bunch of, excerpts from Buechner books. So anyway, that's what got me involved in the whole Christian publishing arena. And after we had done all that, it was around the time when I turned 60 and basically asked myself, okay, what do I do the rest of my life? I didn't want to go back into high tech. So that's when I started Writing for Your Life, basically, as Jackie said, a resource center for spiritual writers. But I thought, well, maybe I could take what I learned in working for Mr. Buechner and help other Christian writers. So, Writing for Your Life has been as many free resources as I could possibly find to help support writers, and then conferences. Beginning in 2017, we did a series of in-person conferences all over the country, and then when the pandemic hit, we converted those to online conferences. As a result of that, as I was kind of networking my way through the Christian publishing industry, I kept hearing that authors of color were really underrepresented in terms of number of books get published. And I said to myself, well, I'm not an editor, I'm not an agent, I've never worked at a publishing house, but everywhere I've ever been in business, so much is dependent upon who you know. And I said, I know how to do conferences. So let me, put together a conference that would foster relationships between writers of color and people from the publishing industry. And so here we are, a few years later, and we've done 10 of those conferences, and all kinds of book deals and magazine articles and all those kinds of things have come out of that. So the third thing I launched, as Jackie referred to a moment ago, is called Compassionate Christianity. I was hearing from people that there was no good online focal point for progressive Christians. So I said, okay, well, let me at least create something. So that's what CompassionateChristianity.org is meant to be. And those 3 businesses, as Jackie mentioned, have now been sold to other people. So Writing for Your Life and Compassionate Christianity are now owned by Kate Rademacher, and Publishing in Color is owned by Joyce Dinkins, an African-American veteran of the Christian publishing industry. And I'm very grateful for that on multiple levels. First of all, I knew I was going to have to hand those off to someone at some point, or, they would gradually fade away just like I was. The second thing is that I'm thrilled about the people that picked them up. Both Kate and Joyce are just wonderful people, very committed to taking those efforts further. And then the third thing is that it allowed me to go start additional new things. And as you can probably tell, that's what's really in my blood. Even before doing all these things, when I was back in the high tech days, that's what I really loved doing, was launching new businesses. So, one of the things that I launched during the pandemic was How to Heal Our Divides. I was doing a lot of reading, being at home an awful lot, reading a lot of things about anti-racism and political divides, religious divides, and a lot of great books, but they were mostly oriented toward, here's the history behind the issue, here's why you should care, but very little about, okay, what do we do about it? So, and kind of being a more pragmatic engineering type, that's more what I was looking for. So I at the end of 2020, after the election, the 2020 election, I said, okay, let me reach out to some people and see if, they think this is a good idea. So I was kind of looking for roughly 25 to 30 different contributors to write chapters in a book that would focus on, organizations doing something about healing different types of divides. So I started kind of having those conversations in the middle of November. And by Christmas, I was oversubscribed. I already had more people that said yes to doing this than what I had planned for. And that was out without paying anyone anything up front. I told them, I said, I would, be glad if this book is profitable, to share the royalties, with all of you. I don't care about making any money on this. This was not my objective. The objective was to, build awareness on these organizations that, were doing all these great things. So, to make a long story short, because of self-publishing, the book became available in May of 2021. So basically about 5 months from when I started talking to someone about it to when the book showed up, on Amazon available to order. And I still look at that and I said, did that really happen? I talked to, one of my favorite publishing companies about doing this book, but it wouldn't have shown up for another 2 or 3 years. And I just like, I'm too impatient, I can't wait that long. So that's why I chose to self-publish it. And, a lot of you read this and, I appreciate, everyone who's ordered a copy of that, but that was the first version of it. And, as you know, it's people like Brian McLaren and Diana Butler Bass and Parker Palmer and Shane Claiborne, they're all contributed to that, as well as all these organizations that I had found out about that were doing all these specific things. So that's kind of how that thing happened. I'll wait till later to tell you about some of the other things that I'm working on that haven't been announced yet. But that's kind of the story behind how the first, incarnation of How to Heal Our Divides happened. And, I look back at all of that and I'm still just kind of amazed. 15 years ago, if you had asked me about any of this stuff, I would have looked at you like you were crazy. I mean, none of this was on my radar screen.
This is a great parable, right, of God's providence, also of spaciousness and creative potential when there's a need and it's the right time. I'm just floored when I hear you repeat this beautiful story about being oversubscribed with these stories. And, maybe it's the power of your professional networking and the web of relationships you were able to connect in with as you put out the call. But I would love for you to share a little bit more with us about, how you pitched the vision of the book and what you see, what you observe, kind of theologically as you think about some of the contributors and some of the themes and patterns that we can see show up in the first collection.
Sure. Well, I'm not a trained theologian, so it's really difficult for me to, comment on anything very deep in that regard.
Power to the people.
But, I had this series of, for lack of a better term, God moments, over the past several years of my life that I can't explain. The things just fell in my lap. Frederick Buechner just fell in my lap. Publishing in Color just fell in my lap. The whole idea for this How to Heal Our Divides was built out of a frustration, as I mentioned, of, kind of like, okay, what do we do about it? Here's some serious problems. What do we do about it? And so, other than that, it was just a pragmatic approach of how do you get it done? And, as I mentioned, in the middle of November, I started socializing this with different people. And one of the first people I talked to was Brian McLaren, who's been incredibly supportive and helpful with virtually every project I've ever done. And, I started talking about this idea and he said, oh yeah, here's this person, off the top of his head. He knew all these folks that were already doing things in this area. And so, I went back and looked at some of these people. And the next day I said, Brian, would you mind, introducing me to these three people that you mentioned? And so he did that immediately. And like, I heard back from them immediately. And they said yes immediately to this. And I started doing the same kind of thing, with other people in my network. And, at that point in time, again, this was right after the 2020 election. And, we'd just gone through basically 5 years of political angst and agita and gnashing of teeth. And there was a lot of interest in what do we do about it? How do we deal with the polarization that, at least within my lifetime, I haven't ever seen before. And so, I think the timing of it was right. I think the need for it was there. And, because of having this network of people that I had established for completely different reasons. It was all through the Writing for Life and Publishing in Color work that I'd done, which was all around writers, just trying to help other people with their writing, that ended up being, utilized by God for a completely different reason. So again, how do you predict this kind of thing? You can't, I can't, I never could have. But oh my gosh, to me, it speaks volumes. I mean, as part of the new work I'm doing, I'm reading, Henry Nouwen's discernment book and, all these other kinds of things to try to understand that space a little bit better.
Mm. Yeah, yeah. Well, one of the things that really tackled me as I was tackling the book earlier this week is how real it is, right? So, I mean, the How to Heal Your Divides, stories of practical examples of individuals, our colleagues, some of whom we know or follow or have read, organizations, of course. But the I guess what I was sensing as I was reading was this renaming for myself just how accessible, right, the power of God is when we pause to share our stories and listen to other stories. And so, each of these very accessible short chapters, are stories of leaders, stories of organizations, just taking time to write a few pages about what's working faithfully where they are as they care about being a force for justice and healing. But also what I particularly appreciate, and I hear this humility in you as you're sharing tonight, there's a humility from the first quotes that you have here, before we turn to the chapters. Frederick himself said that there's love expressed in the book in the presence of real, brave, and beautiful struggle. And so part of what I'm drawn to with this as a resource for myself and conversations with others, is just the way that story opens up conversation and truth telling, but also the importance of just being in the grit and not falling for the lie that we need some big fancy definitive world changing thing. We just need to be reminded that Shane has a wise thing about humility.
Yeah,
and
I really loved his chapter about that.
And the chapter on preaching the common good. I think that's Mark. Talks about the difference between being political and being partisan. But then he goes on and he shares exactly what he did in that 8 or 10 week series that he did at his church. And I'll trail off there. I guess I just wanted to say that there's an accessibility about the book and a humility about the book in that I find very inspiring. In fact, in this paradoxical way, more empowering for me than if it was some lofty treatise of formulas, you know?
Well,
Yeah,
I wish I had the answer, but
yeah,
that's pretty unrealistic. I mean, and I don't think any of us still have the answer. I don't think there is any
yeah,
answer, so to speak, to all of this.
yeah,
Um, but so yeah, I mean, if anybody thinks that they have the answer, then I think that's the wrong answer. But so
yeah.
if you don't preach all of this, from a sense of humility and trying to learn, basically.
Right, right, right. So we're going to turn to questions here in a second. I see at least one coming in. Just in terms of a broad overview of the book, the first section is called "Why This Matters," and if you don't have the book in your hands or on your screen, our colleagues Brian McLaren, Diana Butler Bass, Frank Thomas are some of the folks who've reflected on the why of this moment and need. And I love what Diana says about part of the reason of the why of healing our divides is because it requires healing for ourselves. In the course
It's kind
of
of like straight out of Parker Palmer's books, isn't it?
yeah,
First you gotta
yeah,
look inside.
yeah, exactly. And then it goes right in there from that why does this matter? That first section of a handful of entries into how to, and it is just a collection of stories from various very different settings. Michael asks, here we go, our brother Thomas Gilmore is in the waiting room. Michael Newhart asks, what suggestions do you have for implementing this work in our churches? Thanks for being with us.
Well, thank you. Well, the first, that's a great lead into the discussion guides that we have for each of the two books. There are a series of questions associated with each chapter in the book, and it's organized into either 4, 6, or 8 week group discussions. So, that would be one suggestion. Another is, I'm glad to be on any kind of a Zoom meeting that anybody wants me to be on. If that would be helpful, I'd be glad to, share whatever I can about these people or these organizations or the process around all this.
And there is a monthly online discussion of the book. Is that still
Well,
ongoing?
yeah. I mean, it's basically a series of sessions where I talk with one of the contributors to either book 1 or book 2 and kind of go into greater depth about what they talked about, within their chapters, basically.
Yeah. And then the discussion group, that's the distinct link at the website that I just dropped in
Yes, yes.
in
And
the chat
also,
box.
there's a email newsletter comes out every 2 weeks that's filled with articles and book excerpts all around this topic
Mm-hmm,
of, how to heal divides.
mm-hmm,
So
mm-hmm.
hopefully that's something that would provide nourishment to anybody that's interested in this area.
I just found it balm for my soul to be intentionally putting myself in spaces where um, people are sharing actively success stories, right? And by success, again, I don't mean big, overwhelming, we can all rest up now because it's done. But, the humanizing, the personal conversion, the effective gains on some systemic issue. And, I swear, as I was sitting with this yesterday, I was thinking, man, I just got to stop watching the news. You got to stop watching the news because maybe, and this to Michael's question, the book itself is very, very accessible. So if you don't have it, I mean, I wouldn't hesitate at all saying for 2 or 3 months, my people are just going to read this and just talk about what comes up. But then, the discussion guide, the discussion groups, add a little bit more structure and, what if we charged our people to just immerse themselves in stories of effect instead of watching the news?
Well, you touched on something, Jackie. That was another reason why I did this in the first place too, is because, I watch the evening news just like everybody else, and, it's filled with bad news. And, here's all this good news that's out there that none of us hear about. And so that was another motivation for me to do the book, because, we were in the middle of that pandemic, we've had all this political angst, all this polarization. It's like, we need some hope. We need some awareness and acknowledgement that not everything out there that's going on is bad, that there's a lot of good things. So I'm with you 100% on the need to, bring that into our lives, not just focus on the bad things.
Right. Well, and to be assured of that, not so that I can rest on my laurels, but so that I can be sustained,
Yeah.
right? In community and greater honesty and conversion, my own personal conversion, on name the justice or healing issue, right? So being encouraged for the sake of courage. Yeah. Joyce says shared, she just ordered volume 2. That's great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joyce. Catherine was wondering if the previous sessions on YouTube are still available.
Absolutely.
Catch
Yeah.
that?
So the again, on the How to Heal or Devise website, where there's a tab that says book discussions or group discussions or something like that, and under that are recordings from all of these that have taken place. So yes.
Wonderful.
That's one of the nice things about Zoom, right? You record it and it's there for posterity. So it's a wonderful thing.
Indeed. Colleagues, if there's anyone on the call tonight who's dived into the book in the past, this is a chance to ask any questions you might have about particular sections or authors. If you're like me, just a couple days in, we're just enjoying hearing about the vision of it, right? Maybe you have stories of your own about how to heal divides. That ought to be in volume 3.
Now, I was just I was intrigued by the invite. Thank you, Jackie, by the way.
My pleasure.
Because I noticed someone else on the stream has interim training. I am probably transitioning. I'm doing some interim ministry training right now, and I'm transitioning probably out of long-term, pulpit assigned ministry. And healing divides sounds as much one of the issues that if we can deal with during interim ministry, I suspect it's going to be something I encounter fairly often in doing interim ministry, and that is something that is maybe not as deeply gone into during training. I mean, they can only do so much, to help us and give us some additional skills outside of, regular pastoral ministry, which, you encounter, the need for that healing all the time there as it is. And we don't get enough of it. So I just, in particular, in this season of transition for myself and also growth, I was intrigued by that. So thank you. Looking forward to it. I was out there. Yeah, I'm sorry. Looking forward to it. I was out there looking for the book as well. So yeah.
Good. I mean, I think that's extremely insightful about what you're talking about in terms of the difference of what an interim minister can do versus a quote unquote permanent minister. My perception is that there are a lot of, permanent ministers that are reticent to deal with some of the kind of difficult issues because they figure that half their congregation is going to go away if they say the wrong thing. And that's a whole nother discussion, that I'm sure you guys could have much more fully than I could. But when you're an interim, maybe you've got an opportunity, push the envelope a little bit further than what a quote unquote permanent minister might be willing to do, which, I mean, again, I don't know if that's the right thing or wrong thing, but I know if I was in a minister, I'd probably get fired. I mean, because I'd be pushing the envelope left and right.
Well, our brother Michael might have something to contribute to this line here in a moment. I would just commend to everyone's reading, in particular, chapter 6 with Mark Feldmeier's "Healing Our Divides, Preaching the Common Good."
Yeah.
And Catherine's raising to our attention that some of what might be on our mind when we think about divides are the great social and political and religious divides that are such a burden today. But there's always these overlays of those identity things and the ways in which, internal to the church environment, there may be divides that don't explicitly have anything to do with those issues, although they might very much have to do with those issues. So Michael Newhart, who's with us, is an experienced interim pastor. Do you have anything to contribute to that?
Well, I just want to say that, for one thing, that Brian, we usually make the distinction between settled pastors and interim pastors, since nobody's really permanent.
Good point.
Yeah. And so, I'm plugged into the interim ministry network. Indeed, I had a weekly chat earlier today, and there's a training in a couple of weeks, I think, on conflict, dealing with conflict. So, your work here about healing divides is certainly relevant, and I appreciate Catherine bringing bringing up the interim ministry. And there's certainly a freedom and limitation to both settled and interim. I sometimes think about settled and unsettled, but I just better to say settled and interim, or transition. Another term is transitional minister.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So that's good to make that connection. So thanks, Catherine, for that.
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm do no harm is I think for any of us in ministry is one of the places we try to start with, especially when you're walking into interim ministry. Of course, you don't want to literally do harm, but that is kind of that space where if you can create or find that opening, that opportunity to help folks grow and to patch things up, because divides that have happened, which may or may not be why the pastor who had been there previously is no longer there. But there's usually, there is not always, but often a conflict that has been involved. Sadly, we don't just lose pastors anymore because they've retired. And so I'm really feeling that it's going to be a good crossover for some of the other things that I'm really spending some serious time exploring. So thank you. And thank you, Michael, for the affirmation on that. So, it's good to know that you probably headed in the right direction.
Yeah. Well, and I would just say, as an additional witness on the book, there is this lovely intersection, chapter after chapter of emphasis, a rhythm. Maybe Brian, I seek your best words for this. I think there's a rhythm that is inclusive of systemic change, gritty facing our entrenched racism and classism and sexism, et cetera, with discourse on interpersonal change, individual change. And so I love that there's that, the holism of that, the complexity of that captured in the book with the diverse voices you have.
Well, I wish I could tell you that was all completely by design, but I mean, the truth of it is that, the first book in particular was driven by, who I was able to network with quickly, and who said yes to the project. Now, I was absolutely trying to achieve diversity. I was absolutely trying to achieve both, known names as well as organizations that people had never heard of that I thought were doing good things. But to say that there was a designed rhythm to it would
Oh, I
basically,
didn't say design. I just said
yeah,
rhythm.
well, I didn't
Or-
design it, somebody else did, but,
Yeah.
so the second book was a little bit more intentional, in nature, in that I was really more trying for a greater level of diversity, trying to cover some additional types of divides that hadn't been covered in the first book. So that one is a little bit more, I don't know if intentional is the right word, but designed maybe is another word.
Mhm.
And, one of the things that we did in the second book that I failed to do in the first book was the second book kind of divided into categories, different chapters on different topics, whether it's, racial or political or peacemaking or LGBT or abilities or, other kinds of things like that.
Yeah, indeed. A few other morsels I've found here in the book is in chapter 10, Reverend Dr. Colinthia S. Dowdy, Director of Faith Initiatives at FIGHT, who's been a professor and chaplain, pastor, facilitator for racial justice workshops. And this is like a gritty, honest word about engaging across the racial divides and engaging in the trenches together. She really has just a power-packed indictment about the ways in which institutions can be dangerous, and the ways that people of color often perceive this and experience this in ways that people of racial privilege don't. I just found that really a simple and powerful reminder. And then she goes on 64 to say, the knowledge that you and your BIPOC colleagues are not on the same journey and are not having the same or even similar experiences in the same institution can be bewildering. And I just love the way that her prophetic and pastoral voice is, both in there, right? And again, so each of the authors has their own, voice and writing style, and really just touching on many different aspects of the prism of the journey. Brandon Robertson in the next chapter writes of the need of both activists and advocates, and lifts up the distinction between the energies of change that an activist, and maybe stereotypically a little bit more of a confrontational energy and a challenging energy. And in his language, he uses the language of advocacy to talk about the temperaments, the gifts of folks who are called and equipped to be a bit in the longer journey, the more relational journey, but in sharing his own story, talks about recognizing that a particular moment called for a different tactic than it was normally his, right? And the discernment of that. So I just, again, Brian, just really would lift up a word of gratitude that there's so much that a diverse field of ministers can relate to in this.
Well, all the work that I've done, since I started writing for life, I've put a really high priority on diversity, including voices that may not necessarily always get heard and perspectives that may not always get heard. And so, that's a learning for me, throughout this whole journey too, in terms of the importance of learning from folks.
Amen to that. Yeah. I'm just gonna take a look at the chat box here for a second. Tim asks, do you have any suggestions on healing the divide between conservative clergy and progressive clergy to work together?
Yeah, so I saw that question. The first thing that came to my mind is why? Kind of like, what's the purpose of doing that?
Oh, sorry, Tim, I forgot. I didn't catch the second paragraph.
Yeah, so he said it works with both because I have a theology that's informed by both, but I find that I'm an oddball in my city.
Me too.
I
I'm
can
coming to
believe that.
Iowa.
I can
I'm
believe that.
I'm driving to Iowa to
But
see you.
but again, I say it's like, why? Who cares?
Hmm.
What's the purpose of trying to heal divide with another pastor? And there may be some, maybe it's just you want to be friends with that pastor, or maybe you want to influence their congregation, to be less conservative or more conservative or whatever, what I mean?
Hmm.
So that's the first question that comes to mind is like, what's the purpose behind what you're asking?
Hmm.
And then, you know, then I could say, okay, well, if you're really trying to just have civil conversations between conservatives and liberals more generally, then organizations like Braver Angels or Three Practices or other, there's some other ones highlighted in the two books that talk about, I mean, they don't talk about, they actually have conversations that they set up, intentionally between X number of, people with conservative bent and X number of people with liberal bent on different topics. So there's kind of becoming a more robust opportunity for participation in forums like that are just trying to bring people together and have civil conversations.
Actually, we're hosting a Braver Angels event at my church
Oh, good.
on Sunday afternoon. Chicagoans are invited.
Good.
Yeah, Tim, just listening for you. If you have anything additional to share or ask on that topic.
Yeah, I have a passion to live out Jesus' prayer in John 17, where he says, he prays that they may be one so that the world may know that you have sent me.
Mhm.
How can the world know about Jesus if the leaders and the servants of his church are at each other's necks fighting? How can they see love in Christ if we don't show it?
Well, they won't. And I totally agree. And that's one of the reasons why I said, don't bother fighting with that guy next door that doesn't see it the way that you do. I mean, focus more on the people that are not in either of those churches. You know what I mean? And try to be a role model and an outreach and an ambassador or whatever you want to call it to them. I'd focus on, that audience as opposed to trying to get alignment with someone you may never get alignment with.
This is a
I don't know, that's just that personal opinion, but
I come at the perspective that if the same spirit is working within us, conservative and liberal, whatever, I hate titles for one thing. If the same spirit is working within us both, then we should be able to get along in some way and get past our differences to get to the core of the spirit. And if we don't do so, then we aren't living the life of Christ and the ways of Christ. We are actually not living what we claim we believe. We are lacking integrity as Christians. And the world sees the bullshit in that.
Well, you use some words like if and should, and that I think are very key in that, this description. If it's the same spirit, yes, things should be different than they are today. No one will argue that. But I think it's more a question, where you want to spend your energy. Where's the most fruitful application of the Christianity you believe in? Is it with a group of people that are very entrenched in a different view of the world? Or is it with a group of people who, maybe see things a little bit more open-mindedly?
This is such a rich opening for us. And I wonder, Tim, Brian, if you'd be willing, this could be, I think we have the time tonight that we could just kind of land here for a few more minutes. I'd love to hear what's on the hearts and minds of other colleagues on this question. And in part because, Brian, you lift the the why question is a discernment question. What fields are we called to labor in? And those of us on the call are in diverse settings and probably have diverse sets of experiences connecting denominationally across our theological labels. Yeah, I just wonder if there might be further sharing or questioning on this line from other colleagues here. What does it mean to bridge our divides as clergy?
Well, I appreciate Tim's use of the word calling.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, what do we feel called to? How do we feel called to heal divides? What divides? And so I appreciate, Tim talking about the progressive and conservative, Christians. Brian, does not have that particular, calling. And so I think, it just determines both where we feel called as individuals, but also, what kind of divides we find in the communities we serve.
Mm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Now, whether it's, racial reconciliation or economic reconciliation or just, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it is, a matter of, of calling. I remember I in the last church I served as an interim, I was leading Bible study and early on in my time, someone said, well, now what kind of Baptist are you? And I said, well, I'm an American Baptist. And she said, well, a conservative American Baptist? And so I said, well, I think American is the only adjective I'm going to use to describe Baptist. And, if you want to put some labels on yourself or if you want to put them on me, that's fine. But I'm just going to stop at American Baptist. So, those labels are really very, very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Tim, I don't know what, I don't want to put words in your mouth. What I was hearing a little bit of in your comments was something along the lines of, wouldn't it be nice if all of the horses were all pulling in the same direction, even if we're slightly different breeds and colors and whatnot. And I know that to a certain extent certainly powers and inspires some of the work that I do in interdenominational groups, yes. Although that usually ends up being predominantly being part of the UCC, and inevitably I end up in groups that are, ELCA colleagues and Presbyterians and Methodists, pastors and whatever, and the more conservative Baptist and Anabaptists of our area generally don't end up choosing to be in that circle. And I, to a certain extent, the fact that I work also with some interfaith work, which in a way is partially motivated in some respects by the same basic precepts in the back of my head and heart and spirit, is just the fact that in one way or another, eventually it is the same God that we are looking at and trying to support a journey with. And wouldn't it be lovely if we could, like many of the other issues, sadly, of our modern age, if we couldn't emphasize more the things that we are the same about, that we can agree about, rather than constantly focusing on what's different about us and what we don't like about what the other person is doing. and be able to pull together in a little bit more together. And you're right, a lot of the statistics that are out right now are that, so many people in this country are nuns, NES is because, 20, 30 years ago, they would have identified probably as Christian because that was the passive thing that they were, because that's where their family history was, et cetera. And they've actually been given permission, which is kind of good in some respects. Maybe it's a wake up call to us to say, like, yeah, no, I'm not really espousing any particular, they'll call themselves spiritual, but not religious. And that points to some of the concerns that we understand the differences in the divides, especially as clergy and a very, engaged lay leadership, but to the outside world, and often to a lot of our own parishioners, what those divides are all about are just not very obvious. And it's, to a certain extent, if clergy can't figure out how to get along a little better with each other, how can we expect our parishioners perhaps to do that? I that's a little bit of what I'm hearing on there, that I'm sure a lot of that is overlay of my own thoughts and processes, but thank you.
Appreciate that. Others?
Yeah, and I would have, I really appreciate, just down the road in Kansas, Tim, I appreciate kind of that need to speak to what's kind of a Midwestern conservatism in the midst of folks that are trying to do it in different lights, and talk about progressive things in different lights. And what I've tended to notice is it feels like, how do we build trust with folks that are different, right? In some cases, it becomes, maybe we can have that dialogue, right? Maybe we can sit down and let's talk about some hard things. I appreciate, Brian, your point that may be a non-starter. Maybe our starter then is not in the dialogue of these issues, but it may be about how do we host homeless families in our congregations? How do we do some food drives? How do we work together on to support the local medical mission? And those are some of the ways that may be helpful. Even different different kind of theologies and ideologies in our region. We could do a worship service together, even though it doesn't feel like we're all coming from the same place theologically. And so maybe some of those are different kind of starters. But I appreciate, Tim, the knowledge of, this is something that if we're gonna say that we're in the same tent, how do we acknowledge that, right?
I want to just commend to your reading chapter 8, which is called United in Joint Mission, the Power of Right Relationship to Heal Divides.
That's great.
Beautiful story about a surprising journey of solidarity across evangelical and more progressive lines on making a difference for vulnerable immigrants in the Southwest. Reverend Dr. Alexia Salvatierra, Brian? Salvatierra?
Yep.
Yeah, beautiful. Well, I am so grateful for this conversation so far. While Brian gives us a closing word about volume 2 and finding your next call, I'm gonna pull up the website and just kind of put that in front of people's faces. And then our president, Matt Sturdivant, who was just sharing from down the road in Kansas, will offer a little closing thought and prayer in a moment. Brian, you've got the baton.
Yeah, well, first, Matt, thank you. I totally hear and agree with what you're saying. It's like, I love the focus on, showing how Christians can help people that need to be helped.
Right.
And using that as a role model, as opposed to, trying to convince somebody else of something else. I love the idea of, us trying to spend our energy, the way that Jesus said we should. So anyway, thank you very much for that. So just to to like complete the picture a little bit, as Jackie mentioned, there is a volume 2 of How to Heal Our Divides. And it's got a whole new set of contributors. There's only one person who wrote a chapter in both books. And I won't tell you who that is. You can figure that out. But, volume 2 is basically, a result of the fact that when I was soliciting contributions to book 1 and I got oversubscribed, I kept hearing about all these great organizations. I said, okay, well, I need to do, another book to try to, highlight those organizations. So that's the purpose of what book 2 is about. And, people sometimes will ask me, well, which is your favorite organization or which is your favorite book? And I don't like to answer those kinds of questions because it's kind of like, which is your favorite child?
Right.
But just between us friends, I think book 2 is actually better than book 1 in several ways. So anyway, I'll leave it at that. But
Yeah.
hope you can find it useful. I'm always looking for feedback on that effort. But let me tell you about 2 other efforts that I'm starting now. Neither one of these have been like formally announced yet. One of them is called that Jackie mentions called Find Your Next Calling. And that is basically going to be a discussion group and ultimately a training session and retreats and other kinds of things all around, this idea of, kind of Richard Rohr's concept of the 2 halves of life. I mentioned to you kind of my own background. Half 1 was engineering and business stuff. And half 2, I'm doing all this other stuff that's completely different from that is so much more of a calling. And, Find Your Next Calling is meant to be something to help other people do the same kind of thing. So it's a combination of discernment, and kind of diving into that a little bit more deeply. And then also more practical. Okay, well, how do you launch your own company, your own new business? If you're really driven and you're really called to do something and focus on some particular area. So it's a combination of those kinds of 2 things. And it's just getting started. I just finished the first draft of the website like last week. So, but I will have a newsletter that comes out every 2 weeks starting in May. And we'll also have discussion groups every 2 weeks starting in June. So if you're interested in participating in that, you can either go to findyournextcalling.com or, Jackie can give you my email address. I'm glad to speak with any of you anytime. The other project that I wanted to mention just briefly is another one that hasn't been announced yet called Raising Kids for Good. And it's the outgrowth of an idea from Brian McLaren. He and I were walking down the street about a year ago, and I said something to him along the lines of like, neither one of us are getting any younger. What do you think is the most important thing that we ought to address? And he said, basically helping churches find resources that are inclusive and diverse and not toxic. So if you can kind of imagine the polar opposite of Focus on the Family, what we're trying to create is a resource center, for progressive Christians and churches and families. So Raising Kids for Good, again, not announced yet. We'll do a soft launch this summer and then a more public launch in September.
This is great. Thank you, Brian, for what you do and what you've done, and your ministry of collecting ideas and collecting relationships and collecting important work that's being done as we hear often and again, right? How the world's falling apart and nobody agrees with each other and we're always mad at each other. And I appreciate you saying, but how do we build something else? And I appreciate everybody on this call who's doing that work and came on tonight and is going to turn off their computer and keep doing that work wherever you are in your context. So thank you for all that you do. let me share a blessing with for Brian, for all of you all, and for a nation that is in many ways divided, but a church that is in many ways unified. Let's talk to God about that. Lord, thank you. Thank you for the voices that have been shared tonight, the ideas, the creativity, the hopefulness, the honesty and the vulnerability, all the things that that you have taught us how to be in order to be your church. God, I thank you for Brian's wisdom, the things that he has shared with us, and helped illumine in other voices and other projects and other work. God, we just pray that as our work continues, whatever that work looks like, that you would bless us, bless the usness of the Ministers' Council as we hear from one another, and in collegiality and centeredness and competence, work to be better disciples of you. Lord, I thank you for the chance to be who you call us to be in this Eastertide season, remembering once again what it means to be an Easter people, following your risen hope and glory into the world. In your name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Amen.
Amen.
Blessings and peace, everybody, as you travel on. Glad to be with you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for
Blessings.
having me on, y'all. Great to
Thanks,
meet you.
Brian.
Thank you,
Night.
Brian.